It is recording. Thank you. So again, these 7 petitions, that number of completeness in God, the days of creation, and those first 3 are vertical prayers. We look up to God. So that's the vertical axis of this cruciform shape. And then the last 4, the horizontal, the how we embrace one another, and the things that concern humanity. So cruciform again. So it's incarnational in that sense, that Christ comes down to us, that he stretches out his arms on the cross, that we might come within the reach of his saving embrace. And so we see this pattern in the Lord's Prayer. Now, I also mentioned last week that this prayer looks backward to the Exodus and forward to end times. And it helps us journey on our way. And so this photograph is I took in Jordan, looking down one of the canyons that Moses and the Israelites would have traversed as they came down from the Medeba Plateau in modern-day Jordan down to the Jordan Rift to cross the Jordan and get into Israel. And this is the land of that pilgrimage. And it is the land of Exodus and of the wilderness wanderings. So this would have very much resonated with Jesus's original audience. And I think it's important for us to understand this. And the way that I often describe this is we tend to read the Bible with where we grew up. And so I actually grew up in England. And so, for example, when I think about the 23rd Psalm, I always think of green rolling hills. So when I think about, pilgrimage, this is not what initially springs to my mind. I tend to think of just a long journey, in England or Montana. But this is the landscape of the Exodus wilderness wanderings. And I think this is important because whether we live in this sort of landscape or not, I think this is what our spiritual life can feel like sometimes, or 2020 often feels like this. Pretty barren, not a lot of water, a little scary. You don't know what kind of wild animals are out there. And so this idea of pilgrimage through life, and what that might look like. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's hard. But the Lord's Prayer is with us through all of it. Just as God was with the children of Israel, visible as a pillar of fire and smoke. So when we walk, know that the Lord is with us because of the Holy Spirit dwelling in us, but also because he gave us his words. And the promises of this prayer that he gave us to speak while we go through our pilgrimage. And so I like this as an image of what we might face as we walk through our daily life. And so what is the prayer? Our Father in heaven. Or as we often say it in the older language, our Father who art in heaven. We see in that very first clause both the transcendence and the immanence of God. So the immanence that we get to call God our Father is kind of radical. Now, I often hear it taught that this is the first time that we ever hear that term Father used of God. And that's not true. It's actually throughout the Old Testament. But it takes on a new sort of understanding when we get to this prayer. But I want us to look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament examples, where God clearly is understood as the Father of Israel. Now, the first time we see this imagery used is actually in Exodus. Again, the importance of Exodus for understanding this prayer. In Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 and 23, God's telling Moses to go to Pharaoh to let the people go. And of course, Pharaoh, we know, is going to harden his heart and refuse to let the people go. And so God tells Moses to say this: "Thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let my people go that they may serve me." It's really important. So Israel is not just this people who serve God. What are they?
Children.
Children, right. And that's really important, because what are they in Egypt?
Slaves.
Slaves. And so God is saying to Pharaoh, these are not your slaves. They are my children. And more than that, they're the firstborn. And here's a little bit of the interesting Hebrew context with this. The firstborn children, well, mostly the firstborn sons, sorry, ladies. The firstborn son get a double portion of the inheritance, always. And I know people say to me, well, that doesn't seem fair. Why wouldn't you just divide your property up among all of your children equally? Does anybody know why the firstborn gets a double portion? It's actually to keep it intact. It's to keep the land intact, because what is the primary inheritance of the children of Israel?
Yeah.
It's land. And if you remember, as we get into Israel, God says each of the tribes is going to get this much land. And he actually does basically an ancient real estate description of the land that each tribe will get. And then we see later on that each clan gets a certain portion. And then the clans would divide that up to the families. Well, to keep that land intact, because the land is how a family survived, right? You didn't go to work in a downtown office building. You survived based on what you could farm. And so to keep that land intact and ensure the continuation of your family, the land had to stay intact. And so the firstborns basically get the bulk of the land. But with that comes the huge responsibility of ensuring that all of the extended family survives. So it's a role of great importance. It's privilege, but also responsibility. And because of that, those firstborn children were very, very important. And so God is saying to Pharaoh, these are my firstborn children. And I will do whatever it takes to protect them and bring them safely home to me. So this is not just a statement of, relationship in a very sort of clinical way. It's kind of a shot across the bow. God says, I will do whatever it takes to protect my firstborn. So, Pharaoh, you should let them go before I have to lower the boom. So that's the first time that we see this relationship and this protective roaring of a father to save his children announced. But one of the other places that we see it beautifully expressed is in Isaiah chapter 63. Isaiah, one of the most beautiful books in the Hebrew Bible. Often by Christians called the fifth gospel, because it's so beautiful and points so much to Jesus. But Isaiah 63, verse 16, is proclaimed during the time that the children of Israel are in exile in Babylon, and they feel like all hope is lost. But God knows that it isn't. And so they're crying out to God. And this is what they say. For you are our Father, though Abraham does not know us. Excuse me. And Israel does not acknowledge us. You, O Lord, are our Father. Our Redeemer from of old is your name. So, excuse me, I'm so sorry. The children of Israel know that God is their Father. They have this special relationship, and they know that that goes wherever they are, whether they're wandering in the Sinai Peninsula or whether they're in exile in Babylon. They know that God is their Father and that he will never forget them. So very important there. Why is it so significant, though, that Jesus teaches us to say our Father then? What's different about it? Well, I've heard, again, a fallacy. Some people say, well, it's the word that Jesus uses, this Abba. Actually, by Jesus's day, that term Abba was used quite frequently in Israel, Judah, for describing God as our Father. So it's also used frequently, not as I've heard taught, but as daddy, but more as dad. So it's not as formal as father, but it's not infantile like daddy. It's dad. So it's a closeness of the relationship, but not an infantile term. But what really changes here then is that Jesus is saying, we don't get to call God Father as a nation now, because that was always the understanding, again, that collective idea, but that you as individuals in your prayer can call God Father. So Israel's always been a child of God, but now you as individuals can claim that relationship. And why can we claim that relationship? Because of Jesus. Because who is Jesus?
Son.
He is the only begotten Son. And in him, as Paul will say later, we then are adopted sons and daughters of God. So this relationship now is even closer. And one of the interesting things in the Roman Empire with adoption happened in the Roman Empire. If you adopted someone in the Roman Empire, you could never dissolve that relationship, which is significant because in the Roman Empire, you could actually disinherit or disown your own birth children. But if you adopted someone, you could never sever that relationship. So that idea of being adopted children is incredibly strong in the New Testament. So our Father, but there's something else important here though, this concept of our Father. We do it collectively. So this is the prayer, not just of us as individuals, but when we say the Our Father, I'm not just praying for me. Who am I praying for? The whole church. But it's also our Father, because when I pray this prayer, I really can only pray it in and with Jesus. So because he's the only begotten Son. And so therefore, I tend to, one of the ways that I often pray this prayer is when I say this prayer, guess who's saying it with me? Jesus is. Mm-hmm. So our Father, he's my Father because Jesus is my brother, because this is what Jesus gave me to say. And so he is there with me praying this. But then we move to the immanence. So he is in heaven. Now, heaven is obviously, it's a place, but it's also more than a place. And we're going to talk about that. But this is a photograph of sort of the Hebrew understanding of how the world looked. Now, by Jesus's day, they knew that it didn't look like this, but this continued to be used sort of as sort of a theological or poetic understanding. By Jesus's day, they knew that, that actually they knew that the world was round. We then forgot it and had to relearn it. But actually in the empire at this time, they knew the world was round. But I think this is a really interesting vision that helps us understand actually a lot of the Old Testament passages. So the earth, created by God out of the water. So when he's creating, he separates the waters, and he separated some of them above the firmament of the stars. So think about the world like a giant snow globe. And we've got this big sort of glass ceiling over us. And on top of that then is part of the water that God separated in the beginning. And he'll occasionally open little windows, and that's how we get rain. So that was part of the understanding. The other part he put under the earth, so under the firmament, so it drained down. And that's where we get springs and rivers when he sort of opens those doors. And so that we don't get flooded all of the time. And then the earth stands on these giant pillars that hold it up. And we see the tops of those pillars. They're the mountains. And within the firmament, then you have the stars. And above all of that, then, is the heaven of heavens. That's where God's throne room is. Below the earth, you see that description of the underworld. Another word that you see that referred to in the Hebrew Bible is Sheol. Now, Sheol gets translated and comes into sort of our Christianity as the term hell. They're actually a little different in how the Hebrew Bible understood that and how we understand that idea of hell today. But that's kind of what it looked like. So God is near us because he's our Father, but he's also far above us in the heaven of heavens. And I think that's a good thing for us to remember. We often sort of fall into traps in our understanding of God when we either make him too far above us or when we make him too much like us. And so part of this very first clause, the way it challenges us, is to remember that God is Father, but he's also God whose ways are not our ways and whose thoughts are not our thoughts. As high above the heaven are his thoughts from us. So it kind of encourages us to hold that intention when we're praying and when we're thinking about God. Now, one of the reasons that I think that this prayer can be really important is how we then think about heaven as we walk through this life. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second because for any of you that know me well, you'll know that I am a huge fan of what I call rabbit trails. So weird little pieces of information that I think are really interesting and that may not really have a lot to do with the topic at hand. Well, we're going to go down a little rabbit trail because it amuses me. So this is that Hebrew cosmology of the earth. It also then takes this form. This is a map from 1581 that was drawn by a German, Heinrich Bunting, called the Cloverleaf Map. It was actually just sold at auction in Israel, had been part of a collection of a biblical historical geographer who taught at the University of Bar Ilan in Tel Aviv for many years, and he's selling his collection now. And if I'd had $200,000, I would have loved to have owned this. But anyway, this Cloverleaf map shows something. It's theological. It's not a map you could really navigate by. What's in the center of the world?
Jerusalem,
right. So you've got Europe, Asia, Africa, Americas are over here. But the center of the world is Jerusalem. And so during the intertestamental period, so about 400 years before Christ, this idea grew up very strongly in Judaism. You see it a lot described in the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, that Jerusalem is the navel at the center of the world. And this map describes that. So this is the center of the world. Why? Because this is where God became human. It's where God in the temple before Jesus met humanity. So this is the axis mundi, the whole axis of the world. And the Temple Mount there in Zion, this of course is the Dome of the Rock, but it's a really beautiful building. It's on the Temple Mount built by King Herod. So this floor here, Jesus walked on that floor when he went to the temple in his times. The temple itself was knocked off, the Temple Mount, and then with the Islamic conquest, this then was built later. The Gold Dome was put on by the King of Jordan. But inside the Dome of the Rock is what's called the foundation stone. I actually got to go in a couple of years ago, which is very hard to do. I had to pretend I was part of a UN tour and had to be completely covered from head to toe, but was really honored. It's very, very difficult to get in as a Westerner anymore, but I was really, really fortunate to get in and see the foundation stone. The foundation stone, according to Jewish tradition, is the rock at the top of Mount Zion, the very peak of Mount Zion. It is the place where Abraham was told to take Isaac, and then where God provided the ram for the sacrifice instead of Isaac. But it also then, with this idea of Jerusalem being the navel of the center of the world, and then if you think about that map with the draining of the waters, the tradition says that this is the rock that God used as the giant plug to keep the waters below the earth. So this is the drain hole for all of the waters that went below the earth, and the foundation stone, because this is the stone that, according to Jewish tradition, was in the Holy of Holies beneath the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was not just the special box where the 10 Commandments were kept, but it was actually understood to be the throne where God would sit when he was with his people in the temple. So very, very important. So this idea of Hebrew cosmology and Jerusalem being the center of the world. All right, end of rabbit trail. So, Our Father in heaven. This prayer is really important for us as we journey in our pilgrimage in life, because what's the thing that most of us are most afraid of if we admit it? We're afraid of dying, right? What comes next? Does my life have meaning? What if I die today? Well, I think one of the reasons that this prayer is such an important prayer for our journey is because it reminds us that we have a Father who is already in heaven. And so if he's our Father, we know that he's going to bring us home because we're his firstborn. We don't have anything to worry about. And so when we remember those two things, we are reminded that as we journey this life, and as difficult as it might be at times, we have hope because he is our Father and because he is in heaven. But of course, one of the questions I get all the time is, what's heaven like? Well, the word heaven in Hebrew is shamayim, which is plural. And so it's the heavens. And so it's this sort of vast expanse where God dwells. But it's mostly, heaven is sort of a place, but it's also mostly a relationship, because heaven is being with God. So, it's one of those things that we have to get our head around a little bit. At the end of the day, I don't really know what heaven looks like. We get glimpses, but most of all I know, I'm going to be held in the arms of God. So I don't need to worry about the rest. So there's some good news, but we do get glimpses of it. We get glimpses of it in Isaiah 6, the throne room of God. We get glimpses of it in Revelation 4 and in Revelation 21. So Dr. Tolles, if you would turn to Revelation 4 and read a little bit for me.
Testament.
Oh. So Revelation 4, let's see, how about from verse 3 to verse 6?
And the one seated there looks like jasper and carnelian, and around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. Around the throne are 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones are 24 elders, dressed in white robes with golden crowns on their heads. Coming from the throne are flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God. And in front of the throne there is something like a sea of glass, like crystal.
Okay, thank you. So what do we know? It's like jasper and carnelian and like crystal. So it's beautiful. And notice that those are just, it's like. So it's a way of saying it's so beautiful. It's the most beautiful things that we can think of on earth. It's like that, but it's even better than that. And then, of course, we see, we get the lightning and fire and the 7 spirits of God. So those are all ways of saying this is God's holiness. It's the refiner's fire. So the heaven is a place where there will be no evil, because all of that will be burned away. So if there's no evil, what is left? Goodness, justice, righteousness, love, all the best. Everything that is God. God is love. God is light. God is truth. God is righteousness. He is justice. That's what's left. So it's beautiful, but it's also goodness. It's better than we can imagine. So we see all of that. And then we get to Revelation 21, and we're given the description of the heavenly Jerusalem. And again, we see some of that language of precious jewels used. So the streets are like gold and the gates are like pearls. But the part of this that I love the most is actually the river that runs through it. And on either side are trees whose fruit is good for eating, and they're never out of season. That's God's way of showing John, the prophet John, that first of all, there's water. Remember the picture of the desert? It's not like that. You never have to be thirsty. And there's so much food, it never goes out of season. You're never going to be hungry. Never thirst, never be hungry. Should remind us of what Jesus teaches us in the Gospel of John about Eucharist. Come to me all, if you're thirsty, come and drink. John chapter 4, to the woman at the well, drink from me and you'll never be thirsty again, and you'll never have to keep coming to the well. It's Isaiah 25, the feast on the mountain, once death is destroyed. This abundance, this good wine on the lees and the marrow and the fatness, and you will never be hungry. There is such abundance that you're never going to have to worry again. What is heaven like? It is like all of that. It is all sickness. It is all sadness. It is all sin and evil being done away with, and it is goodness and abundance. And who is there? Our Father. Who else is there?
Our brother.
Jesus. He ascended into heaven, right? So we read about the ascension in Acts 1. We see the outpouring of it and the results of it as we go throughout the New Testament. And one of my favorites is John 14. Before the crucifixion, Jesus says, look, I'm going to go before you. I'm going to go and prepare a place for you, because in my Father's house are many rooms. It's one of the readings for the burial in the Episcopal Church, right? In my Father's house are many rooms. Or the old King James language said, in my Father's house are many mansions, right? And I think I prefer the rooms language, because mansions makes you think that you're all going to have your own little mansion in suburbia, right? But that means that we're kind of spread out. And I don't really want to be parted from God at all. When I finally get to heaven, I can't wait to be like having dinner with him every night. I don't want to be in my own giant mansion somewhere. So he talks about, in my Father's house are many rooms, and I am going to go and prepare a place for you. Great Hebrew context here. In Israel, they tended to build, and you still see this in some cultures today. You'd build your house, and then as your sons would marry, the wives would go and live with the father's family. And so guess what they kept doing?
Adding on.
You just kept adding on. And ultimately, what we see in some of the archaeological excavations is that you wind up with these almost like family compounds, not crazy compounds, just great family compounds that actually start being circular. And so as the family grows, and the whole center courtyard area then is where the extended family all hangs out. And they took care of their sheep and goats together in this protected enclosure. They baked their bread together. So all the women would gather to make bread together, or to shear the sheep together to make the wool. And so you get this idea then of a family that just keeps growing and adding on. And as they do, it's more protected. And this brings me to one of my favorite words, the word grace. The word grace in Hebrew is actually a beautiful word, chen, that has lots of children words associated with it. And one of those words actually means encampment. And it's talking about this kind of round way of setting up Bedouin tents, or then how they would build these family complexes. And the father of the whole compound then would have all of his sons and their wives gathered together in the safety and protection of his grace. So we are encompassed in the arms and the grace of God when we're thinking about that John 14. And the Son, of course, one of the words that is used to describe Jesus is that he is the bridegroom, and we, the church, are the bride. So he's gone ahead of us into heaven to build us our room on the Father's house, so that where he is, we may be also. Our Father in heaven. When we journey this life, when we're scared, when we're sad, when we're fearful, our Father in heaven. All of this idea, again, remember, like Augustine said, the whole gospel, all the scriptures are gathered in this prayer. Our Father in heaven, and we can just hold on to that line as we walk our pilgrimage. You can pray just this line for probably the rest of your life and never plummet its depths, never exhaust its goodness or its wonder. Rabbit Trail. This, I love this, this little, it's actually carving on a tomb in ivory from Milan. And this is the Ascension. And I just love it because you see Jesus, he's actually climbing the clouds like they're steps, and the Father's hand reaching out to bring him home. This is how he will reach out to bring us home at the end. He'll come down and take us, and the Father will be waiting for us, just like in the parable of the prodigal son, to welcome us home. And you see the tree there. It's an olive tree, right? the olive branches of peace because of our reconciliation to God through Jesus' atoning death on the cross. And so this reminder that as this woman's grave in her death, that Jesus went ahead to prepare a place for her, so she had nothing to fear. So this beautiful altar carving. So then, hallowed be thy name. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The names of God. So we want to hallow. Hallow means to keep sacred or to treat with reverence. But what's really interesting with the Greek Aramaic of this prayer, hallowed, it's actually an aorist tense, which basically means it's been done. It's already an accomplished fact. So not an ongoing process. And so this actually moves us into that end times, right? And we see this discussed in Philippians, but also reminding us that at the end, at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow. So right now, God's name is often not hallowed, is it, in our world? In fact, I actually came across somebody who told me the other day that their grandchild thought that Jesus was actually a swear word. So they're so far from any kind of Christianity or Christian worldview now that to them, Jesus is not a person, he's not biblical, he's not a religious figure, but that name is literally just a swear word. Because she said to me, I said to this person, to my child, oh, do you know Jesus? And he said, no, we're not allowed to say that name because it's a swear word. Scary stuff in the world today. So the name of God is not hallowed right now, but we pray it with the full expectation of the end times. And in God's economy, that's already the case, even if we don't know it yet. But we also pray it, I think, in the reminder that part of our call as Christians is to let the world know that that name is hallowed in everything we do and say. So when I pray this, part of what I pray is, God, help me show that your name, that you are sacred and holy and good in everything I do this day. Don't let me bring any kind of disfavor on your name and who you are today. Hallowed be thy name. Within Judaism, they did not use the name of God, the tetragrammaton. Let me do this real quick so you can see it. See up here, this Yod, He, Vav, He, it's called the 4 letters, the tetragrammaton. It is the sacred personal name of God. It means I am who I am. In other words, God is the to be verb. Nothing is without him. It's his personal name. And within Israel, they would only say this name with great hesitancy, because to call on the holy name of God was to actually call God to be present in all of his glory. Remember that refiner's fire and awe and wonder into a situation. They really were only supposed to say the name of God, the tetragrammaton, once a year, and only one person should have said it. That was the high priest, and he would say it on the Day of Atonement, when he was praying that God would forgive the people for all of their unknown sins or forgotten sins, so that they could be in right relationship with him. So here are some of the other names of God that they would use instead. And I think sometimes to think about these different names of God changes our relationship with him. And so he is Yahweh, holy, amazing, but he's also Adonai, my Lord, but he's also Yahweh Rohi, the Lord is my shepherd. And he is the God who sees me. He's the God who provides for me. He's the one who shepherds me. He's my everlasting God. And so one of the ways that I think this prayer can be helpful is to think about the names of God and how he reveals himself to us through scriptures and in prayer. And so hallowed be his name. that we want to hallow his name in all that we do. And then also, what are some of the names for Jesus? Emmanuel, God with us. The I am. Jesus claims that title for himself. I am the good shepherd. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of heaven that gives life to the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So all of those ways God reveals himself to us. And then how do we hallow God in our prayer and in our life? But always remembering, and here's again the good news, it's already done in God's economy. So we know the end of the story, which for me is always a really hopeful thing. So that's what I want to cover today. Next week, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, and give us this day our daily bread. So are there any questions about that? All right, then let me pull up Compline. And John, if you will lead Compline again.
Well, wait a minute. I had a question.
Oh, you do have a question. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just curious on the heaven bit.
Uh-huh.
N.T. Wright is giving us a very new perspective or view of heaven, and not as in we all get caught up in the rapture, or as anything like that, but that heaven is essentially, behold, I make all things new here on earth, and it's a restoration of creation, because God said in the beginning, it is good. So why would God say, I'm going to take what is good and then I'm going to blow it up?
Right.
How are you seeing that?
Well, actually, N.T. Wright is not giving us anything new. He's giving us a very ancient understanding of what heaven is. So he is actually looking further back. We see actually both of those ideas by Jesus's day. So we see some kind of a new heaven, but we also see the restored. The Hebrew Bible is primarily the restored earth, because God doesn't make junk. He fixes what needed to be fixed. So that's actually the view that I tend to hold, that God makes all things new. It's a restoration, but it's even better than it was before. So it's not just a return to Eden. It's actually greater than Eden, because we know that Satan was in the garden, right? So it's better, but it is a return. But we do see the descriptions of fire. And so what's the description of fire referencing? It's cleansing. I don't think it's a blowing up. It's a cleansing of the old so that what was can be again, but even better. So I do agree with N.T. Wright, and that is actually who am I to agree with N.T. Wright, right? He's smarter than I'll ever be. But anyway, yes, but I do agree with N.T. Wright, and that is really the Hebrew Bible view. The sort of destruction and the recreation, I think, is more poetic. And the ideas of fire and what have you is really the poetic way of saying God is going to cleanse and destroy sin. And for example, the river in Revelation 21 actually takes us back to Ezekiel 47. When we see the river flowing from beneath the temple of God, it comes out from inside the Holy of Holies. It gets wider and deeper as it goes. And as it touches everything, it restores everything. So what is dead lives. And so that very desert thing, as you get to the Dead Sea, then the Dead Sea itself becomes a sea that is living with as many types of fish as the Mediterranean has. So Revelation 21 is, I think, simply restating what we saw from Ezekiel 47. And that is not, we blow the world up. It is, the world is cleansed with the holy refining fire of God to be what it once was. So yeah, does that help?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Ezekiel 47 is one of my all-time favorite passages in the Bible too. It's a great passage. So other questions?
That N.T. Wright, that was the author that I read, yeah.
Great. And what's the name of that book? I read it a while ago.
I looked it up. It's The Lord and His Prayer.
Lord in His Prayer. Oh, and we have somebody holding it up there. So thank you. Yeah. And then N.T. Wright also did write a book, and I think he has a little video series even of, what did he call it? Surprised?
I was surprised by hope.
That's C.S. Lewis, isn't it?
No, that's N.T. Wright.
N.T. Wright wrote Surprised by Hope.
Okay. Which he borrowed from C.S. Lewis. So
Yeah, because C.S. Lewis wrote Surprised by Joy. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Is that it? Okay. Yeah. So anyway, well, thank you, Lizzie. Yeah. So those are both good. Although I have a friend that knows N.T. Wright and says of him that he never met a topic that he didn't write a book about. But anyway, but a lot of his books are really good. So, all right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share our Compline. And John, if you would lead us in Compline.